Hi, in this video, we are going to learn about API and web services. In the previous video, we have learned integration directions. We learned about outbound integration and inbound integration. And I have showcased one example for each. Now, this is the right time to learn a little bit more technical on integration. So, before implementing integration, it's good to know what is meant by API. So generally, API is a set of rules and protocols which will allow two different applications communicate with each other. If you want two systems to communicate each other, then you need a medium called API. So what is mean by web service? Web service is a software which is built on the server side which helps to expose the data. So think as a database as a layer. On top of the database in the server, you have a piece of code, you have a software. That software will expose the data outside. That software is generally called as web service. So bottom layer you have a database, on top of that you have a software program called web service. The web service will give you the information, but can we access the web service directly? No, you can access the web services only through APIs. So the top layer will be the API. Imagine in that way. So let's discuss a little bit in detail about API with a real-time example. The real-time example is discussing about a restaurant. Imagine you are going to a restaurant and you are placing your order, and the waiter is taking your order information, and then the waiter collects the order and send it to the kitchen. So there is no direct interaction between you and kitchen, right? The chef basically. So the waiter is act as a medium between you and the kitchen. He collects your order and send the order back to the kitchen. Once the food is ready, the waiter again coming into the picture. He collects the cooked food and distribute it to your table. So you have ordered your food and the food reaches your table. You don't know anything about what is happening in the backend. So all you are doing is you are communicating only with the waiter. Imagine the waiter is an API. So at the bottom of your presentation, you are seeing an example for API. You have a web service. The kitchen is replaced with a web service. Web service consists of data. You are using Salesforce. You want to consume your data from your web service. What you will be doing? You will be sending the request to an API. The API will send the request to service, and the service collects the data information and send it back to the API. API again sends it back to Salesforce. So this is how applications are communicating with each other with the help of API and web services. Let's learn about different type of web services. So there are generally two types of web services exist. One is a RESTful service and another one is SOAP service. So widely used services are generally fall in the classification of REST services. It's a representational state transfer. That's what the abbreviation for this. And what is the use of REST service? REST services generally helps to access data in a server which is available in the internet. So basically REST services helps you to communicate between two systems through internet. And what is the format? The data will be communicated in which format? The data will be communicated between the requester and the server in the form of JSON, XML, or HTML. So most of the widely used communication format will be JSON. So the power of RESTful services is, you can implement it in a quick in a quick period of time, and it is more powerful to distribute the data over internet. So REST services are commonly used type of REST services these days. And how to access a REST service? How you will access Google? You have an address. Similarly, each and every services will also have a address. So using the address, you can access the REST services. Address in the sense, in the internet terms, we call it as URL, right? Uniform Resource Locate. So another type of service is called SOAP service. The SOAP service transfer the data only in XML format. The problem with this SOAP services is, building the SOAP services require more efforts because it has a lot of computational power required to build that. But one thing is, a little bit favor of SOAP is it is more secured, and there is no URL exists there to access that SOAP services. Instead of that, all those information will be available in a file called WSDL. Okay, so the WSDL file will help you to access the data in the server with the help of SOAP service. In the entire video, we are going to learn about only REST services. Okay, now let's discuss about REST services. Generally, the REST services authentication is concerned two types of authentication. One is open, another one is secured. Open in the sense, from the name itself, you can easily understand. If you want to access a data in a web server, if the web service is open, no need to give any username and password. You can simply go and enter the URL. You will simply get the response back. So that type of authentication is called as open authentication. So REST services, you are going to access the REST services using API. One type of authentication is open authentication. No username password is required. Obviously, there is no security involved. So most of the open authentications are available these days only to learn and practice how API really works. No business is, these days really exposing the data without any authentication, right? So definitely, if it is a business data you have in a server, you wanted to expose outside world through internet, then definitely authentication is required there, right? So that's a secured authentication. So when we are discussing about secured authentication, different type of authentications exist. One is simple key based authentication and username and password, and another one is OAuth 2. We will be seeing some of the authentications types in the upcoming videos. So basically the broad classification is open APIs. We have secured APIs also. Okay, so let's move on. Now we are going to learn individual pieces of API. Suppose if I want to access a data in another system, then I have to use API. I'm pretty clear about that. What all are the pieces of an API? An API generally consists of an endpoint. For example, I wanted to access a list of movies available in a web server, or you call it as a web service. A third party system which has a list of movies in its database, and it is exposing its data to the outside world through web services and API. Now, if I want to see what all are the list of movies available, then I need to know the address of the endpoint, right? Address means, let's say, for example, you are trying to access Gmail. In your browser, you will be writing as gmail.com, or you are going to access YouTube. In your browser, you will be typing youtube.com. That is generally called as address, right? So that address is, technically in the API terms called as endpoint. So each and every web services will have an endpoint. If you don't know the destination, you cannot go to the exact place, right? So similarly, if you want to fetch a data, then you should aware of where the data resides, in which service the data resides. That address is called as endpoint. And then I know the endpoint. I know the endpoint of my web services and API. But what are the actions I can perform on that endpoint? The actions generally performed is called as methods. So in the context of API, we will be using a word called endpoint, which specifies the address of your endpoint or the address of your web service. Method, what kind of action I can perform on top of that web service, whether I can fetch records, or I can insert record, or I have to update record, or I have to delete record. So when you're trying to access this endpoint, you have to mention what kind of action you are going to perform on the endpoint with the help of API. And next is headers. In the previous slide, we have learned two types of authentication. One is open, one is secured, right? If it is a secured, endpoint, then you have to pass the username or password or keys as an authentication mechanism, right? So that is passed through headers. So headers means a small packets of data which will be passed through the internet, which will consist of the authentication information. And then body parameters. So these are some of the terms we generally used in API. While writing the code, you will be understanding it a little bit better, but still, I'm trying to explain what is meant by body parameters. Let's say I need to create a new movie. If I want to create a new movie in the web service or in the server, then I need to give what is the movie name, who is the director, when it was released, right? What is the language of the movie? These informations are generally called as input data. So in the API, you will be using body parameters to send input to your web services or your endpoint. Okay, I know the endpoint where my web service resides. I know my API endpoint. I am sure about what kind of action I'm going to perform on my endpoint. I know how to pass the authentication information, and I have a data also to send to my server. So once everything is submitted to your endpoint, the endpoint or your web service will do some action and it should respond back, right? That is generally called as response status code. If you hit an endpoint, the endpoint will return you a response code. The response code generally tell us what happened, the action is completed or not. If you receive a response status code called 200 OK, it means that the method you performed on the web services is successfully done. Now, the response is 200 OK. Suppose if your endpoint want to send your data back, for example, you are trying to fetch a list of movies. When you are trying to fetch a list of movies, then your web services will hand you back the list of movies, right? That is generally called as response body. Let me quickly, show you how this can be performed. Let's say, let me try to open a browser window and I'm trying to access an endpoint. This endpoint is basically an open endpoint, no authentication is required. So I'm trying to give the endpoint here. Once I hit my enter button in my keyboard, see the response from my endpoint. This is the response body, right? Response body from my endpoint. The endpoint is showing me the list of movies available in the database, right? So when you hit an endpoint, the endpoint return you a list of movies. That is generally called as response body. So these all are the different terms we will be using when implementing APIs. Now, in the previous slide, we have discussed about what kind of action you can generally perform on the web services, right? So that is generally called as method. So what are the methods are available in an API? Get method. Get method helps you to fetch all the data. Just now I have shown you a list of movies, right? What's the method I have used? The method is get method. So if you use a get method, then the API will give you a set of data. It can be used to fetch data. If you want to create a new movie, then you will be using a method called post that will help you to insert your data. If you want to update an existing movie, then you will be using put. If you want to update some of the attributes of a movie, let's say I wanted to change only the movie name or director name, that's called partial data. Then you will be using a method called patch. I wanted to delete a movie from my web service, from my endpoint. Then the method I will be using will be a delete. Now let's discuss about responses. So you are hitting an endpoint. The endpoint will send you back a response code as well as body data, right? The response code are 200 OK, which means that whatever the request you have sent to the endpoint is successful. 400 bad request. Let's say you are trying to send a data to your third party web service. The data is not in the correct format. Then obviously you will be getting a response saying that 400 bad request. Sometimes I wanted to access an authorized and I wanted to access a secured endpoint. I'm giving a wrong API key or wrong username and password. Then the web service will send me back a status code called 401, which is unauthorized. Sometimes my endpoint itself, there is a spelling mistake. Then the response will be sent back as 404 not found. The server says that I'm not able to identify the resource which you are looking for. And 500 internal server. Internal server error means there was some issue in the web service side to process your request. Then it will send a response back as 500 internal server. So these all are the some of the common HTTP status code which is sent by the web service back to your Salesforce. From Salesforce, I'm trying to hit a third party service. Then the third party web service may send these status code based on the kind of request I'm trying to make. So if you know these basic concepts, then it's easy for you to implement hands-on the APIs, how to access the API, how to consume the API. It will be easy for you. Hope this video might have given you some clarity on what is mean by API, what is mean by web services, what are the types of web services available, what all are the pieces of APIs, what is mean by response code. All those informations we have learned in this video. In the upcoming videos, we will be implementing the API. We will be implementing, how to consume the APIs through Salesforce as well as some special tools called Postman. If you want to leave any feedbacks on this material, please scan this QR code and submit your feedback, or you can click the link below the at the bottom of your presentation and you can leave your feedbacks.
If you are interested to learn Salesforce, visit AJ Skill Development website. There you can find our course curriculum and you can come to know about the list of courses we are offering. We are offering Salesforce Administrator and Salesforce Development courses. To know about us and the team, you can visit our About Us section. This is an organization we are doing Salesforce training from 2018 and we have trained and guided 2000 plus candidates so far. And if you also want to know about our placement assistance, visit our placement assistance section where you can find the list of people and the category. You can see the list of people who got trained and placed from our side. You can also visit their LinkedIn pages to get to know about our training and also the feedback from the relevant trainees. Okay. And also, if you want to do the course inquiry, click on contact us. You will see the form. You can fill the form and submit the inquiry. Our team will get back to us. Thank you.